As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over Salem village, a man named young Goodman Brown stepped out from his home and onto the quiet street, ready to begin a mysterious journey. However, just after he had crossed the threshold of his doorway, he hesitated and turned back for a moment. He did so not out of fear, but to share a tender farewell with his young wife, whose name, Faith, seemed especially fitting given her gentle nature and pure heart. In response to his pause, Faith leaned forward and extended her charming, youthful face into the evening air, the soft breeze catching the pink ribbons that adorned her cap and making them flutter playfully. With a note of concern in her voice, she called out to her husband, hoping to delay his departure or at least send him off with her love and a sense of unease at his going. With a gentle, almost mournful tone in her voice, Faith leaned in close to her husband, her lips near his ear as she spoke in a soft whisper. "My dearest love," she began, her voice filled with quiet pleading and a hint of sorrow, "I beg you, please delay your journey just for a few more hours. Stay here with me until morning, and sleep in the comfort and safety of your own bed tonight." Her eyes held a mixture of affection and fear as she continued. "You see, I am but a lonely woman, and when I am by myself, I am often haunted by strange and troubling dreams, thoughts so dark and unsettling that I sometimes grow frightened even of my own mind. This very night, of all the nights in the entire year, I feel a dread that I cannot quite explain. Please, my beloved husband, stay by my side tonight and give me the peace of your presence." Young Goodman Brown looked tenderly at his wife, and with a mixture of affection and resolve in his voice, he responded, "My dearest love, my sweet Faith, please try to understand. Of all the nights in the entire year, it is this very night when I must be away from you, though I do so with great reluctance. I would not choose to leave your side unless it were truly necessary. But this journey, as you so gently call it, must be undertaken this night and completed before the sun rises again. It is something I must do, and I promise to return to you as soon as it is done." He offered her a reassuring smile, though there was a shadow of regret in his eyes, and added with a slight, playful tone meant to comfort her, "Come now, my sweet and lovely wife, could it be that you already mistrust me? Have you begun to doubt me so soon, even though we have only been husband and wife for 3 short months?" His words were meant to soothe her fears, even as he prepared to leave her behind, if only for the night. "Then may God watch over you and keep you safe," said Faith tenderly, her voice soft with emotion as the pink ribbons in her cap fluttered gently in the evening breeze. "And I pray that when you return to me, you will find everything just as it should be, peaceful and well." Her words were simple but heartfelt, filled with both love and quiet concern. "Amen to that," replied young Goodman Brown with a solemn tone, deeply moved by her parting blessing. "Now, dear Faith," he continued, "say your prayers faithfully tonight, and go to bed before night falls completely. If you do so, no harm shall come to you while I'm away." With those final words, they took their leave of one another, she reluctantly returning indoors, and he setting off down the path toward his unknown destination. As he continued walking through the quiet village streets, the sky darkening above him, he was just about to turn the corner by the meeting house when something made him glance back over his shoulder. There, still lingering in the fading light, was the figure of Faith. He could see just her head peeking out from the doorway, her expression shadowed with sadness and worry, her pink ribbons still visible as they moved gently in the wind. Poor little Faith, Goodman Brown thought to himself, struck with a sudden pang of guilt that pierced his conscience. What a cruel and selfish man I must be to leave her behind like this, and for such a grim and secretive purpose. His mind returned to her earlier words. She spoke of dreams, troubling ones. And as she said it, I swear I saw a look of fear and foreboding on her face. Could it be that some vision, some premonition, warned her of the evil I'm about to encounter, or partake in, tonight? No, I must not believe that. The very thought of it would break her heart. It would destroy her to know the truth. Then, with a deep sigh, he resolved inwardly, almost as a promise to himself, she is truly an angel sent from heaven to walk this earth. After tonight, after I've done what I must, I will never again leave her side. I will cling to her, follow her goodness and innocence like a sacred path, and let her guide me toward salvation. With this noble-sounding resolution fresh in his mind, that he would cling to his virtuous wife Faith and follow her toward a righteous life after this one troubling night, young Goodman Brown felt a renewed sense of justification, as if his good intentions for the future somehow excused the questionable task he was now undertaking. Emboldened by this self-reassurance, he quickened his pace, venturing deeper into the shadows of his dark errand. The path he followed was a dismal one, winding through a forest thick with the tallest, most somber trees, whose heavy branches and dense foliage seemed to conspire together to block out what little light remained from the fading day. The woods pressed in so closely that the narrow footpath barely found space to thread its way forward. Wherever it passed, the trees closed behind him almost immediately, as though trying to swallow the trail whole and conceal any trace of passage. The silence and solitude of the forest were profound, yet strangely oppressive. It was the sort of loneliness that stirs the imagination into restlessness and fear, for in such utter isolation, surrounded by countless trees and twisted branches, one cannot help but feel watched. The countless tree trunks, like silent sentinels, offered infinite places for unseen eyes to hide, and the tangled canopy above seemed to close in with every step. In such a place, a traveler may walk unseemingly alone, yet have no idea how many others might be hidden nearby, watching in complete silence, an invisible crowd cloaked in shadow. Disturbed by this eerie thought, Goodman Brown's mind turned to fearful imaginings. There could be a savage lurking behind any one of these trees, he muttered to himself, picturing a fierce, unseen Indian waiting in ambush. Then, with a sudden chill creeping up his spine, he added under his breath, and what if, God forbid, the devil himself were walking right beside me at this very moment? With that grim thought, he cast a nervous glance over his shoulder, half expecting to see some dark figure looming just at his elbow. The silence deepened, the shadows seemed to press closer, and Goodman Brown's unease grew heavier with every step into the heart of the dark forest. As young Goodman Brown walked along the narrow, shadowy path, his thoughts still clouded by unease and fear, he turned his head to glance behind him once more, still half expecting some dark presence to emerge from the woods. In doing so, he passed a bend in the road, one of those sudden crooks where the trees seemed to lean in even more closely, shrouding the way ahead in deepening gloom. When he finally turned his gaze forward again, his heart gave a startled jolt at the sight that met his eyes. There, seated calmly at the base of a large, ancient tree just a few steps ahead, was the figure of a man. He appeared to be of respectable bearing, dressed in plain but proper clothing, his appearance neat, modest, and seemingly unremarkable, as though he might have been a town elder or a traveling gentleman. Yet there was something unsettling about his presence, something quietly dissonant beneath the surface of his ordinary look. As Goodman Brown drew nearer, the man stood up in a smooth, deliberate motion and began walking alongside him without hesitation, as though the meeting had been prearranged or expected by both parties. The two men now traveled together, step for step, in silence for a moment, until the stranger broke it with a calm and mildly reproachful tone. "You are late, Goodman Brown," he said, looking at him with a steady gaze. "As I made my way through Boston, I heard the clock of the Old South Church striking the hour. That was no less than 15 minutes ago." The young man gave a slight start at the sound of the stranger's voice, firm but unhurried, and responded with a voice that trembled faintly. His unease was evident, not only because of the eerie stillness of the woods or the man's sudden appearance, but also because he had, on some level, anticipated this very encounter. "It was Faith who delayed me," Goodman Brown admitted, his voice low, the name of his wife carrying both affection and guilt. Her parting words and sorrowful expression still lingered in his mind, casting a shadow over the path he now walked. By this time, the darkness had settled thickly over the forest. It was no longer merely evening, it was deep dusk, and in that particular part of the woods where the two travelers now walked side by side, the shadows were at their most profound. The overhanging branches formed a tangled canopy that blocked nearly all traces of the fading sky, and only the faintest glimmers of dim, scattered light filtered through the leaves, leaving their path shrouded in gloom and mystery. As best as one could make out through the half-light, the man accompanying Goodman Brown appeared to be around 50 years of age. He seemed to belong to the same social class as Goodman Brown, a modest, respectable level of society, and there was something in his appearance, particularly in the way he carried himself, that closely resembled the younger man. While they did not share a striking physical likeness in terms of specific facial features, their expressions and demeanor were so similar that an observer might easily have mistaken them for close relatives, perhaps even father and son. Despite his plain attire, which matched Goodman Brown's in its simplicity, and his unassuming manner, the older man bore an air of quiet authority and worldly experience. There was something subtle but unmistakable in his bearing that suggested he had seen much of life and understood its many faces. He moved with the confidence of one who had long been acquainted with both the respectable and the shadowy sides of society. It was not difficult to imagine him seated comfortably at the governor's banquet table, speaking with ease among the dignified elite, or even holding his own in the royal court of King William himself, should such a situation arise. And yet, there was nothing flashy or outwardly arrogant about him. His sophistication was more a quiet undercurrent than an overt display. Still, for all his presence, the only outwardly striking thing about this mysterious companion was the staff he carried. It was no ordinary walking stick, it was carved with such extraordinary craftsmanship that it seemed to take on a life of its own. Fashioned in the likeness of a large black serpent, the staff was so intricately and convincingly designed that it almost appeared to move. In the dim, flickering light of the dusky forest, one might have sworn the serpent-like staff writhed and twisted subtly in the man's hand, as though it were alive and coiling of its own will. Of course, such a perception must have been an illusion, a trick of the eye aided by the uncertain and shifting light of the dark woods. But still, the strange sensation remained, unsettling and difficult to dismiss. "Come now, Goodman Brown," called out the older traveler with a voice both firm and coaxing. "This sluggish pace is hardly suitable for the beginning of an important journey. If you are already growing tired, then here, take my staff to support you." As he spoke, he offered the serpent-like staff he carried, its dark form curling eerily in the gloom of the forest path. But Goodman Brown, rather than quickening his step, came to a complete halt. His expression was uneasy, and there was a note of internal struggle in his voice as he replied, "Friend, though I have kept my word by meeting you here as we agreed, I now feel compelled to return from whence I came. My conscience is uneasy. I have scruples about the nature of what we intend, as you well know." "Is that so?" responded the older man, a faint, knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It was a smile not of surprise, but of amusement and hesitation he had perhaps anticipated. "Very well, let us continue walking," he said smoothly, "and we shall talk as we go. If I cannot persuade you, then you are free to turn back. After all, we've only just entered the forest." But Goodman Brown, though he resumed walking almost without realizing it, exclaimed with sudden intensity, "Too far. I have already gone too far." His voice trembled with emotion. "My father never took such a path into the forest, nor his father before him. We have been an upright and honorable family for generations, devout Christians, ever since the days of the martyrs. And now, shall I be the first of the Browns to tread this path and keep such company as this?" "Such company, you mean to say," remarked the elder traveler, interpreting Goodman Brown's pause with uncanny insight. "Well said, Goodman Brown. I know your family well, better than most among the Puritan folk, and that is saying something. Why, I was close with your grandfather, the constable. I was there when he whipped that Quaker woman so sharply through the streets of Salem. And your father, too, I gave him a pitchpine knot, lit from the hearth of my own fire, to burn down an Indian village during King Philip's War. They were both good friends of mine. We had many a cheerful walk along this very path and laughed heartily together as we returned home after midnight. And now, for their sake, I'd very much like to be friends with you as well." "If what you say is true," said Goodman Brown, his voice filled with confusion and disbelief, "then I am amazed they never spoke of such things. And yet, perhaps I should not be surprised. Even the whisper of rumors like those would have ruined them, banished them from all decent society in New England. We are a people who pride ourselves on prayer and good deeds, and we have no tolerance for wickedness such as you describe." "Wickedness or not," said the traveler calmly, tightening his grip on the strange, writhing staff, "I am a man well connected in this region. Many of your most respected leaders are friends of mine. The deacons of more than one church have shared the communion wine with me. The selectmen of various towns have chosen me to lead them. A great number of representatives in the great and general court are loyal to my interests. Even the governor himself and I must keep some matters secret for the sake of state affairs." "Can such things truly be?" cried Goodman Brown, staring at the older man in shock and growing horror. "Even so, I have nothing to do with the governor or his council. Let them conduct themselves as they wish. They are no example for a simple husbandman like myself. But if I were to go further on this path with you, how could I ever look into the eyes of our good minister back in Salem village? His voice alone, when preaching, makes me tremble every Sabbath day and lecture day." Until now, the older traveler had listened with a composed and serious expression. But at this last comment, he burst into an uncontrollable fit of laughter, so loud, so gleeful, and so wild that he seemed almost possessed by mirth. He shook from head to toe, and in his hand, the staff shaped like a serpent appeared to writhe and twist in harmony with its master's laughter. "Ha! Ha! Ha!" he roared again and again. Then, at last regaining control of himself, he said mockingly, "Go on, Goodman Brown, go on with your noble objections, but I beg you, don't make me laugh myself to death." Now thoroughly irritated and increasingly distressed, Goodman Brown snapped, "Well, to end the matter once and for all, I must think of my wife, Faith. The very thought of her dear, innocent heart breaking over this would be more than I could bear. I would rather suffer a broken heart myself than be the cause of hers." At this, the older man's expression changed, and he spoke more solemnly. "Ah, if that is truly the case," he said, "then go on your way, Goodman Brown. I would not wish for Faith to come to harm, not for the sake of 20 old women like the one hobbling ahead of us on the path." As he said this, the elder pointed with his staff to a female figure walking just ahead. In the fading light, Goodman Brown recognized her at once. She was none other than Goody Cloyes, a woman renowned in Salem for her devoutness. She had taught him his catechism when he was a boy and remained one of his trusted moral guides, second only to the minister and Deacon Gookin. Truly, it is astonishing that Goody Cloyes should be so deep in the woods at this hour, he murmured in disbelief. With your permission, friend, I'll take a short detour through the woods until we've passed her. As a stranger to you, she may question my company and my destination. As you wish, replied the traveler calmly. Take to the woods, then. I will continue along the path. Accordingly, Goodman Brown stepped aside and moved through the trees, careful to keep an eye on the path. From behind the cover of the woods, he watched as the older man approached the woman. Goody Cloyes, surprisingly quick for someone of her age, was walking with surprising speed and murmuring indistinctly, likely a prayer, Goodman Brown assumed. Then, the older traveler reached forward with his staff and gently touched the back of her neck with what seemed to be the serpent's tail. At once, the pious old woman shrieked, "The devil!" The man smiled, leaning casually on his twisted staff. "Ah, Goody Cloyes," he said, "so you still recognize your old friend?" "Indeed I do," she replied, her voice filled with familiarity and even fondness. "Yes, it is you, in the very image of that old gossip, Goodman Brown, the grandfather of that silly young man wandering in the woods tonight. But would your worship believe it? My broomstick has vanished, stolen, I suspect, by that mischief-maker Goody Cloyes. And that, too, just when I had anointed myself with all the proper ingredients, the juice of smallage, cinquefoil, and wolfsbane, mixed with fine wheat and the fat of a newborn babe," the elder traveler added knowingly. "Ah! Your worship remembers the recipe," she exclaimed with a delighted cackle. "Well, as I was saying, I was fully prepared for the meeting tonight, but with no broomstick to ride, I had to walk. They say there's a fine young man to be brought into our circle this evening. But now that you're here, will you lend me your arm? We can be there in the blink of an eye." "That may not be possible," he replied, "for I cannot spare my arm for you, Goody Cloyes. But here, take my staff, if you will." With that, he cast the serpent-like staff at her feet. And though it may seem impossible, it appeared for a moment to come to life, perhaps even one of the magical rods once lent to the Egyptian magicians of old. However, Goodman Brown could not confirm what he saw. In his astonishment, he lifted his eyes to the heavens for a moment, and when he looked back down again, both Goody Cloyes and the writhing staff had vanished without a trace. Only his mysterious companion remained, standing as composed and calm as ever, as if nothing unusual had occurred at all. "That old woman taught me my catechism," Goodman Brown murmured softly, the simple sentence carrying with it a deep and disillusioning weight. Everything he believed about morality, faith, and the people who shaped him seemed suddenly to tremble under the force of what he had just witnessed. The two travelers continued along the shadowed forest path, the darkness thickening around them with each passing moment. The elder companion urged Goodman Brown to keep moving at a steady pace, encouraging him to stay committed to the path they had begun. He spoke with such calm authority and persuasive eloquence that his words seemed not merely spoken aloud but rather to emerge from Goodman Brown's own thoughts, as though the arguments had taken root in his heart and were blooming naturally from within, instead of being planted there by another. As they walked, the older man reached up and broke off a slender branch from a nearby maple tree, intending to fashion it into a walking stick. The air was cool and damp, and the twigs of the maple were still wet with the evening dew. Yet as soon as his fingers touched the small branches, something unnatural occurred. The fresh, living wood shriveled and dried up in an instant, as though it had been exposed to the heat of a scorching summer sun for an entire week. What had been dewy and green just moments before was now withered, brittle, and lifeless, as if by some invisible and sinister force. Despite this strange event, the pair continued walking at a brisk and steady pace, moving deeper into the forest's dark heart. Eventually, they came to a shadowy, hollow part of the road, where the path dipped low and the gloom thickened. Here, overwhelmed by doubt and inner turmoil, Goodman Brown abruptly came to a halt. He glanced around at the grim surroundings, then turned aside and resolutely seated himself on the broad, moss-covered stump of a tree. There he remained, motionless and firm in his decision, his face stern with determination. "Friend," he said at last, his voice stubborn and unyielding, "I've made up my mind. I will go no further. Not a single step more will I take on this cursed errand. So what if some miserable old woman, one I once thought bound for heaven, has chosen instead to consort with the devil? Is that any reason why I should turn my back on my dear faith and walk the same path into darkness? No. Let others do as they will, I will not follow." The elder traveler, however, showed no sign of agitation or disappointment. He simply nodded, his expression as composed and unreadable as ever. "You'll likely change your mind in time," he replied with cool assurance. "Sit here for a while. Rest yourself. And when you feel ready to continue, You may use my staff to help you along the way." With that, the older man left Goodman Brown seated on the stump in the midst of the dark and lonely woods, surrounded by silence and uncertainty, the path stretching ominously before him. Without uttering another word, the older traveler tossed a maple branch, now fashioned into a withered, serpent-like staff, toward Goodman Brown. Then, in an instant, he vanished from sight so quickly and silently that it was as though he had dissolved into the thickening shadows of the forest itself. One moment he was there, the next, he had been swallowed by the gloom, leaving no sound or trace behind. Left alone in the dark hollow of the road, Goodman Brown remained seated for a few moments on the tree stump, now feeling a profound sense of relief and self-satisfaction. He congratulated himself silently on the moral strength he had shown. He was proud that he had resisted temptation and turned back from what he now recognized as a sinful and dangerous path. His thoughts filled with approval of his own resolve, he imagined with satisfaction how confidently he would greet the village minister the following morning during their customary walk, how he would look into the old man's eyes without a trace of shame. Nor would he fear the steady, penetrating gaze of Deacon Gookin, whose judgment he once might have feared. Now, with his conscience clear, he would meet them both without hesitation. Even more pleasing to his thoughts was the image of the night ahead. A night that, just hours earlier, he had believed would be spent in wickedness and spiritual ruin, would now instead be spent peacefully and innocently, in the comfort and purity of his own home, resting sweetly in the loving embrace of his wife, Faith. The very idea filled him with joy, and he found comfort in the belief that he had preserved both his soul and his marriage from harm. But just as Goodman Brown was lost in these comforting and virtuous reflections, he was startled by the sudden sound of hoofbeats approaching along the path. Horses were coming, their hoofs thudding against the earth with steady force. Alarmed, and feeling the instinct to hide, Goodman Brown quickly moved from his spot beside the road and slipped into the edge of the forest. Though he had resolved to do no wrong and now prided himself on resisting evil, he could not entirely shake the sense of guilt that clung to him, the guilt of having come this far on such a dark errand, even if he had now turned away from it. His conscience, though lighter than before, still warned him to remain unseen. The sound of hoofbeats grew steadily louder, accompanied by the low murmur of two voices engaged in solemn conversation. The cadence of the approaching footsteps and the grave, measured tones of the speakers indicated that the riders were elderly men, talking soberly as they made their way down the forest road. Goodman Brown, hidden just within the edge of the woods, listened intently, his senses heightened by the eerie darkness and the strangeness of the moment. The sounds of the riders and their horses passed remarkably close to his hiding spot, no more than a few yards away, it seemed. And yet, strangely, though they were so near, he could not see them. The heavy gloom of that particular bend in the road was so profound that even their close proximity did not pierce the darkness. Though the riders' figures were evidently brushing against the twigs and smaller branches at the roadside, he could hear the gentle rustling and snapping. There was no visible interruption in the faint light that stretched across a narrow opening in the forest canopy above. If they had passed through that sliver of moonlit sky, one might have expected their silhouettes to momentarily block the glow. But they did not. It was as if their forms cast no shadow at all, or were not entirely of this world. Frustrated and curious, Goodman Brown shifted nervously between crouching low and rising cautiously onto the balls of his feet. He pushed aside the leafy branches in front of him and leaned forward, peering out as far as he dared without revealing himself. He strained his eyes into the blackness, but no matter how hard he tried, he could not make out even a shadow of the travelers or their horses. This lack of visibility vexed him all the more because he was increasingly convinced that he recognized the voices of the two unseen men. Though it seemed nearly impossible, he could have sworn that the familiar tones belonged to none other than the village minister and the venerable Deacon Gookin, two men he had always regarded with the deepest respect. Their voices, calm and unhurried, matched exactly the way they sounded when riding together to some important religious function, such as an ordination or a meeting of church elders. It was their habit to ride together in just this manner, speaking with the same quiet solemnity. As they continued along the road, still unseen but clearly audible, Goodman Brown remained frozen in place, deeply disturbed by what he was hearing. Then, just before the sound of their voices began to fade into the distance, he heard one of the men pause to break off a small branch or switch, perhaps for use as a riding aid or walking stick. The dry snap of wood echoed softly in the darkness, further confirming the nearness of their presence, even if their forms remained invisible. "In truth, Reverend Sir," spoke a voice bearing a strong resemblance to that of Deacon Gookin, "were I forced to choose, I would sooner forego the honor of attending an ordination feast than miss the gathering scheduled for tonight. It is said that a diverse and notable company will be present. Some of our brethren are expected from as far away as Falmouth, and others are coming from Connecticut and Rhode Island. Even a number of Indian powwows will be in attendance, and though their practices differ from ours, they are rumored to be remarkably well versed in the arts of dark and forbidden knowledge, nearly the equals of our own in that grim regard. And, what's more, I hear that a virtuous young woman is to be formally welcomed into communion this evening." "Well said, Deacon Gookin," came the somber, familiar reply in the old and dignified tones of Salem's minister. "Come, let us quicken our pace. Spur your mount, we must not be late. You know as well as I do that the proceedings cannot begin until I arrive at the appointed place." With that, the hoofbeats resumed their rhythmic clatter, gradually fading into the darkness of the forest. The two men, once heard so clearly, now seemed to merge into the surrounding wilderness, their voices swallowed by the shadows of the trees. And yet, the air still seemed to echo strangely with their conversation, words so uncanny, so incongruous with the sanctity these men were supposed to represent. It was not down any known road to a chapel or house of worship that they rode. No church had ever been erected in that dense wilderness, nor had a solitary Christian soul ever knelt there in honest prayer. Where then, Goodman Brown asked himself in horror, could these revered men be traveling so deep into such a dark and heathen place? Struck to the core by the revelation and its implications, Goodman Brown instinctively reached out to steady himself by grasping the trunk of a tree. His knees weakened, and his strength seemed to drain from his limbs as if he might collapse to the ground. A heavy, crushing despair settled over his spirit, his heart sickened under the weight of betrayal, confusion, and disillusionment. With trembling breath and a soul in turmoil, he raised his eyes heavenward, seeking solace in the eternal certainty of the sky above. But even as he looked upward in desperation, doubt gnawed at his faith. Was there truly a heaven above him, a celestial realm governed by justice and light? The stars shone brilliantly in the night sky, and the dome of heaven, vast and deep, stretched overhead, but his soul could not find comfort. Nevertheless, summoning what remained of his resolve, Goodman Brown clenched his fists and declared with desperate defiance, "With heaven above and faith below, I will yet stand firm against the devil." Yet as he held his gaze aloft, determined to pray and anchor himself in divine strength, something strange occurred. Though the forest was eerily still and no wind stirred among the leaves, a dark cloud began to sweep rapidly across the sky, blotting out the bright stars directly above him. The rest of the sky remained clear and blue, but at the zenith, where he had just looked for comfort, the heavens were now obscured by a swiftly moving mass of blackness. And from within that ominous cloud there emerged a confusing, indistinct cacophony of voices, echoing as if from a great distance but growing steadily louder. Goodman Brown strained to make sense of the murmurs, and for a moment, it seemed to him that he could recognize the voices of his own townspeople, men and women he had known for years. Some were pious, people he had shared pews and communion tables with. Others were less godly, known to indulge in the pleasures of the tavern. But all their voices now mingled in a great, indistinct chorus, floating above him not from earth, but from the swirling darkness overhead. One voice rose above the rest, a young woman's, filled with sorrow and apprehension. She was lamenting, perhaps pleading for mercy or reconsideration, though her tone betrayed a hesitation, as if she feared both what she was asking and what she might receive. Surrounding her were the voices of the unseen multitude, both saintly and sinful, who seemed to urge her forward, encouraging her participation in whatever unholy rite awaited. "Faith!" cried Goodman Brown, his voice breaking through the stillness of the night with a tone filled with agony, anguish, and desperation. The name, once spoken with love and tenderness, now echoed hollow and distorted through the depths of the forest, as though the dark and tangled wilderness itself had become a vast, mocking chorus. The trees and hidden shadows repeated his cry with eerie reverberation, "Faith! Faith!" As if the very spirits of the forest, or perhaps other tormented souls, were also searching desperately for her, stumbling blindly through the dark woods in sorrow and confusion. His anguished exclamation had scarcely left his lips before a deep silence seemed to press in all around him. With bated breath and a heart pounding with fear and hope, he waited for a reply. But the silence was broken not by comfort, but by something far more harrowing. A distant, terrible scream pierced the air, shrill and sudden, as though it came from the very soul of a woman in torment. Yet this scream was quickly drowned by a swell of voices, whispers and cries blending together in a chaotic, almost inhuman murmur that soon transformed into peals of wild, cruel laughter. This haunting sound faded as the black cloud, which had hung menacingly in the sky, began to drift away, disappearing into the night and revealing once again the still, starlit expanse above. And then, as if in mockery of the silence that followed, something light and fluttering descended from the heavens like a feather on the breeze. It danced through the air and came to rest on the branch of a nearby tree. Goodman Brown reached out with trembling hands and grasped it. What he held in his fingers chilled him to the core, a pink ribbon, delicate and familiar, unmistakably belonging to his wife. "My faith is gone," he exclaimed, his voice hollow with shock and despair. For a moment he stood there, stunned and motionless, unable to fully grasp the meaning of what he held. Then, all at once, the full weight of the symbol struck him. The pink ribbon, so simple, so innocent, had become the ultimate emblem of his loss, of his crumbling belief. "There is no good on earth," he declared bitterly. "Virtue is an illusion, and sin is not some fearful evil, but merely a word. The world belongs not to God, but to the devil. Let him come. Let him take what is his." Overcome with hopelessness and fury, Goodman Brown gave a terrible, unnatural laugh, loud and manic, rising from the depth of his shattered heart. With that unholy sound still echoing in the air, he seized the serpent-like staff left by his dark companion and began to move forward again. But this was no ordinary walking. He advanced so swiftly and with such unnatural speed that he seemed less a man and more a phantom, flying through the forest rather than walking or running, as if propelled by rage and madness alone. The path he followed became more and more obscure, losing all semblance of a road and finally disappearing altogether. Still, he pushed onward, deeper into the blackest heart of the forest, driven by a dark and terrible instinct, the same twisted force that draws humankind toward temptation and destruction. Around him, the forest came alive with dreadful sounds and sights. The groaning and creaking of the ancient trees seemed like the voices of ghosts. The wild beasts howled in the darkness. Savage cries, possibly those of lurking Native American powwows, rang out into the night. At times, the wind seemed to mimic the tolling of a distant church bell, as though parodying sacredness in a wicked tone. At other moments, it swelled into a great roar, sweeping through the trees and around Goodman Brown as though all of nature herself were laughing in scorn and malice at his descent into despair. Yet even with all this horror surrounding him, the most terrifying figure in that dreadful scene was Goodman Brown himself. He had become a creature more fearsome than the spirits, beasts, or devils that might have dwelled in that infernal forest, and he did not shrink from their presence. He embraced the darkness now, and whatever humanity or innocence once lived within him had been cast aside. "Ha! Ha! Ha!" he roared into the night, mocking the wind as it howled back at him. "Let's see who laughs the loudest now," he challenged, as though daring the night and all its demons to confront him. "Do not presume to frighten me with your sorcery and devil's tricks. Bring your witches. Summon your warlocks. Call forth your powwows and your infernal lord himself. I am Goodman Brown, and I walk among you. Let them fear me as much as I was once taught to fear them." Truly, throughout the entirety of that eerie and bewitched forest, there could be found no sight more terrifying than the man who now surged forward through its shadowy depths, Goodman Brown himself. He darted wildly beneath the towering black pines, brandishing his serpent-like staff in mad, frantic sweeps, his whole body seized with a kind of unholy fury. At times, he burst out with shocking cries of blasphemy so dark and vile they seemed to taint the very air, and at others, he let loose with fits of maniacal laughter that were so unnatural and full of madness they stirred the very echoes of the woods. Those echoes bounced off the trees, twisted and multiplied, until the whole forest seemed to join in a devilish chorus of laughter, as if mocking or celebrating his descent into chaos. No visible demon, no ghostly apparition, could compare to the horror of Goodman Brown in this state, for when evil takes hold in a man's own heart and rages within his soul, its manifestation is more dreadful than any outward form the devil might assume. So this possessed and frenzied figure hurtled forward through the thickening gloom, driven by some wild tempest inside him, until suddenly, flickering through the dark trunks ahead, he glimpsed a fiery red glow. It pulsed and danced as though a great fire had been kindled in a clearing, perhaps from fallen trees and brushwood ignited in a blaze, casting its fierce, blood-red flames up into the midnight sky. For a brief moment, the driving fury within him lessened, and he paused, standing still as the howling wind seemed to quiet for an instant. In that pause, he became aware of a distant sound, a solemn and swelling hymn rising up from the direction of the firelight. The tune floated toward him slowly and heavily, borne on the night air with the combined force of many voices singing together. Goodman Brown recognized the melody. It was one that had often echoed through the small meeting house in his own village during Sabbath services. But now, in this unholy place and hour, the familiar hymn took on an eerie tone. As the final verse faded, its echo was replaced not by the expected stillness but by a ghastly and overwhelming chorus. It wasn't human voices that joined in this refrain, but rather the very sounds of the desolate and darkened wilderness itself, howling winds, creaking boughs, distant wails, merging together into an awe-striking harmony that chilled the soul. Overcome by the terror and strangeness of the moment, Goodman Brown cried out, but such was the power and eeriness of the forest's voice that his own exclamation was drowned out completely, swallowed by the roar of the wilderness, lost in perfect unison with its haunting cry. During a brief moment of quiet, Goodman Brown cautiously moved forward until the bright light came fully into view and struck his eyes. At one end of a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by the dense, shadowy forest, there stood a large rock. It had a rough, natural shape that resembled either an altar or a pulpit. Around it burned 4 tall pine trees. Flames leapt from their tops, while the trunks remained strangely untouched, giving the appearance of giant candles lit for a nighttime gathering. The thick canopy of leaves and vines covering the top of the rock was fully ablaze, casting flickering light high into the dark sky and spreading a strange, shifting glow across the clearing. Every hanging branch and leafy garland was caught in the fire. As the red light flared and dimmed, a large crowd appeared in flashes, visible for a moment in the firelight, then swallowed again by darkness, emerging again as if from the very shadows, suddenly filling the lonely forest with life. "A solemn and darkly dressed group," remarked Goodman Brown quietly. Indeed, they were just as Goodman Brown had described, a serious and darkly dressed gathering. Among them, shifting in and out of view between the shadows and the fiery light, were faces he recognized, people who would sit the next day at the province's council table, and others who, every Sunday, lifted their eyes toward heaven and spoke kindly from the holiest pulpits in the land. Some even claimed the governor's wife was present. At the very least, there were noble women known to be close to her, along with the wives of respected men, a crowd of widows, older unmarried women of fine reputation, and many young girls, visibly nervous that their mothers might spot them. Perhaps it was the flickering firelight that confused Goodman Brown's vision, or perhaps he truly did recognize many familiar faces from the Salem Village Church, men and women well known for their devoutness. Good old Deacon Gookin had arrived and was standing beside his much-revered minister. But to Goodman Brown's shock, these solemn and respectable figures were mingling freely with people of shameful reputation, men known for their immoral lives and women of scandal, people whispered about for their vile actions and even suspected of terrible crimes. Yet there was no division between the saints and the sinners. The righteous did not shrink away from the wicked, nor did the wicked seem ashamed in the presence of the righteous. Among them too were Native American priests, powwows, who had long haunted the forest with strange and terrifying rituals, more chilling even than those tied to English tales of witchcraft. But where is faith? Wondered Goodman Brown, and as the thought brought a spark of hope to his heart, it also made him tremble with anxiety. Another verse of the hymn rose into the air. It was slow and mournful, the kind of melody the pious might cherish, but its lyrics were filled with the deepest understanding of sin and hinted at even darker truths that no ordinary person could fully grasp. Only fiends could know such secrets. Verse after verse echoed through the clearing, and each was followed by the haunting chorus of the wilderness, like the deepest tones of a grand organ. When the final, terrible line of the hymn was sung, there followed a dreadful sound, as though the roaring wind, rushing waters, wild beasts, and every strange voice of the dark forest had joined together with the voice of guilty humanity to honor their dark master. "Bring forth the converts," shouted a voice, echoing loudly across the clearing and into the forest beyond. At the command, Goodman Brown emerged from the darkness of the forest and stepped into the clearing, approaching the gathered crowd. Though filled with dread, he felt a disturbing sense of kinship with them, bound by the wickedness he now recognized within himself. He imagined he saw the ghostly figure of his deceased father in the curling smoke above, beckoning him forward, while a sorrowful woman with a look of anguish, perhaps his mother, reached out her hand as if to warn him away. Still, he was powerless to retreat, unable even to resist in thought, as the minister and old Deacon Gookin took hold of his arms and guided him toward the blazing rock. At the same time, a slender, veiled woman was brought forward. She was led by Goody Cloyes, the once respected catechism teacher, and Martha Carrier, a wild-eyed woman who had supposedly been promised by the devil that she would be the queen of hell. The veiled figure joined Goodman Brown beneath the fiery arch. These were the new initiates, the converts. "Welcome, my children," said the dark figure, "to the communion of your kind. So early in life, you have discovered your true nature and your destined path. My children, look behind you." They turned, and as if a wall of fire had suddenly lit up the woods, the full assembly of devil worshippers was revealed, each face twisted into a shadowy grin of welcome. "These," continued the dark figure, "are the people you have respected since your youth. You believed them holier than yourselves, and you felt ashamed of your sins in comparison to their seemingly righteous lives and upward prayers. And yet, here they all are, joining in my service. Tonight, you will learn their hidden sins, how elderly church leaders have whispered indecent things to young women in their homes, how wives, eager to wear mourning clothes, have slipped their husbands a fatal drink at bedtime and held them close as they died, how young men have rushed to claim their dead father's wealth, and how seemingly innocent girls, do not blush, my sweet ones, have dug tiny graves in gardens and invited me alone to mourn the infants laid to rest. By the bond of your shared human sinfulness, You shall detect every place where crimes have been committed, whether in the church, in the bedroom, in the streets, the fields, or the forests, and you shall rejoice to see that the whole world is tainted with guilt, as if it were stained by one vast bloodstain. And more than this, you shall be able to see into every human heart and understand the hidden root of sin, that dark and endless source of wickedness, which feeds more evil desires than any action, more even than I, at the height of my power, could ever bring to life. And now, my children, look upon one another. They looked at each other, and by the light of the eerie, hellish torches, Goodman Brown saw that the veiled woman beside him was his wife, Faith. Both stood trembling before the wicked altar. The dark figure spoke in a voice heavy with sorrow and dreadful authority, as though some trace of a once angelic nature still mourned humanity's fall. "There you stand, my children," he said. "You depended on each other's goodness, hoping that virtue was not an illusion. Now you see the truth. Evil is the nature of mankind, and only in it will you find happiness. Welcome, again, to the communion of your race." "Welcome," echoed the gathered crowd, their voices filled with both despair and triumph. Goodman Brown and Faith stood together as the last two who had not yet fully given into evil. In a hollow basin carved naturally into the rock, a mysterious liquid glowed. Was it water, blood, or fire? The dark figure dipped his hand into it, preparing to mark their foreheads, initiating them into the knowledge of human sin so deeply that they would see the hidden guilt in others more clearly than their own. Just then, Goodman Brown looked at Faith, and she at him. In that moment, they saw in each other the terrible possibility of corruption. Horrified, he cried out, "Faith! Faith! Look up to heaven and resist the wicked one." What happened next he never knew. At once, he found himself alone in the forest, under a calm, dark sky. The wild wind roared and then faded into silence. He leaned against the cold, damp rock, and a scorched twig dripped cool dew onto his cheek. The next morning, Goodman Brown returned to Salem Village, disoriented and shaken. He saw the minister walking in the graveyard, peacefully preparing his sermon, but Brown turned away from him in fear. Hearing Deacon Gookin's morning prayers, he wondered bitterly what god a sorcerer might worship. When he saw Goody Cloyce teaching a child at her window, he pulled the girl away as if rescuing her from a demon. Finally, he saw Faith, her pink ribbons fluttering, running toward him with joy and relief. But instead of embracing her, Goodman Brown looked at her with stern sorrow and walked past her in silence. Had he simply dreamed the whole terrifying night in the forest? Possibly. But whether dream or reality, it forever changed him. From that night on, Goodman Brown became a stern, gloomy, and distrustful man. In church, he could not hear the holy hymns without being overwhelmed by the memory of the satanic chorus. When the minister preached of divine truth and eternal salvation, Brown turned pale, fearing that hell might fall upon them all. At home, he often recoiled from faith, especially when waking in the night. Even during prayer, he would scowl and turn away. In the end, when he died, he was buried with no hopeful words on his tombstone, only a sense of darkness, for his final hour was one of despair.